And they're now being recorded.
All right, I think this will work.
Ah,
How's that? That look like a clean slide?
now I see a single slide. That's
All right, perfect. Great. Well, I appreciate everybody joining in, and like I said, well, I didn't say before, but I'm pleased to be the guinea pig on trying to get one of these meetings done remotely. I guess the benefit for me is that everybody around the world is stuck in their house with nothing better to do. So that's great, a captive audience. But as Frank mentioned, I've been, many years in the renewable energy space, and I wanted to take this time to focus specifically on what I think is an extremely timely topic. And, it ties in very much to what I do in my professional life. And, we don't go a day not reading about this kind of thing in the news. So I'll run through this, and, what I'm looking forward to certainly is a question and answer opportunity once we move through this. And it'll be interesting to hear perspectives from others of you who are in different locations around the world as well. So as I said before, this is a truly global topic. So when trying to frame this, and when I look at what we do on a day-to-day basis in the renewable energy business, really, climate is center stage. And so I titled this, looking at whether or not energy storage can be a potential solution coupled with renewable energy, some of the critical challenge that we face in society today. And climate change represents a major threat to people, profit, and planet, and we hear about this all the time. And our thirst for energy and how we tend to satisfy that demand is a major contributor to that climate change issue. Renewable energy and energy storage, I think, offers a very compelling solution to this problem. And we've all, just going to move these windows off my screen. There we go, so I can see it better. And we live in a dynamic planet, ecosystems that are changing all the time. I think what's clear and what we're learning and where we're seeing scientific consensus is around the fact that human activity seems to be triggering unnatural and more dramatic change in the climate. We see extreme weather. We've all seen the pictures of extreme weather, droughts, the melting ice caps and so on, kind of ubiquitous climate change pictures that we see in the media. We don't see the impacts of ocean acidification or sea level rise necessarily, but these are all massive trending changes that have the potential for significant economic impact if we don't find ourselves in a position to adapt. In addition, it tends to exacerbate underlying socioeconomic challenges, poor getting poorer, energy poverty. We see disease migration, some of what's being discussed even today around COVID-19 and suggestions that perhaps climate change tends to accelerate the transmission of diseases like that. I mean, we certainly live in a global society that has certainly has a role to play in that. And climate change, as I'm sure many of you are well aware, is often characterized by the slow and steady rise, and perhaps not always so slow, but the steady rise in global average temperature. And if we look at a historical record of global average temperature observations, this particular plot here from NOAA showing a dramatic increase in the rate of temperature rise in around 1960 seems to be an inflection point, but certainly, you know, there's longer records showing that that temperature rise is there, and I think we're seeing more cohesive scientific consensus behind the conclusions that we see in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that certainly suggests there's a correlation between that temperature rise and the increase in the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. This second chart, as you can see, you know, highlights measurements of atmospheric CO2 concentration in Hawaii over that same 1960 to present day time period. And there's certainly that correlation. So the question becomes, you know, do we have time to reverse that? If I back up, you know, when we look at the vertical scale on this chart, it's approaching the 1.5 degrees. The IPCC report on global warming suggests that we need to limit that global average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees or less above pre-industrial levels before we start to cross over into some larger tipping points where the response and the behavior of some of our critical natural systems becomes more difficult to model. And certainly, you know, the models diverge beyond that point, but it's a notable risk nonetheless. And the question is then, do we have time to abate that or reverse that trend? And I think that, you know, that's certainly a possibility, but the runway is awful short. I think we need to do something awfully quick. This is one of the models out of the IPCC reporting that suggests the kind of reduction we need to see in greenhouse gas emissions to reach net zero emissions by 2050. You know, if we look at the next 10 years, so if we look at that chart a decade from now, the critical milestone along that trajectory seems to be limiting global emissions to 25 gigatons by 2030. You know, we're currently up above 40 gigatons. So it's a dramatic decrease. And it raises a natural question that where can we look to for near-term wins? What are the biggest levers that we can pull on this very short runway that would allow us to turn that tide? I think it bears mentioning that the large proportion of the energy that we need that contributes fundamentally to greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis globally is a result of our need for generating electricity, heat, and transportation. And if we can't find a cleaner way of satisfying that demand, then it becomes very challenging to reverse that trend from above 40 gigatons a year to that 25 in 2030. If we take a look at what the energy supply mix is globally in equivalent millions of tons of oil equivalent, you know, you can see from this chart that fossil fuels is still very much driving our demand for energy. Renewable energy is barely scratching the surface. It's at the very top. And coal certainly represents the biggest opportunity for emissions reduction. But that's a massive amount of capacity that would need replacing. And so it's certainly not a simple solution, but we need to look at what's feasible. This is an interesting shot. This is an aerial shot of a project that we constructed in Colorado several years ago, where we have a large solar facility surrounding an existing coal-fired generation plant. I think it represents the kind of shift that we're going to see over the next number of years, and have certainly been experiencing over the past few years. And solar is an exceedingly abundant resource. The amount of energy from the sun that strikes the earth continuously would, by orders of magnitude, satisfy the energy demand that we have as a society. Of course, the question becomes, how do you capture that? How do you make use of that energy? So if we do a little word association, you know, if we think of, you know, if I say alternative energy or renewable energy, I think for many years, the immediate picture somebody has in their mind is, you know, the tree huggers, somebody who's willing to live in the bush and use a compost toilet and sacrifice their lifestyle as they know it in order to make, you know, live off of what I think many people still think is a niche, boutique, or experimental type of technology. And I would suspect that, you know, that's still a widely held and misinformed view that renewable energy is, you know, somewhere in the realm of where we saw personal computing to be in the late 70s, early 80s. The reality is that we're seeing substantial declines in the cost of equipment when it comes to the renewable energy space. This is a chart showing the decline in the cost of solar cells over the last number of decades. I've updated it to today. What we see for projects that are going in the ground at a utility scale, even this year and next, we're well below the 74 cents a kilowatt, 74 that's noted on this chart. And the Swanson effect, for those that don't know, is really photovoltaics version of Moore's law, where in this case, it suggests a 20% price drop in the cost of solar for every doubling of shipped capacity. We're certainly seeing that the forecast is proving out beyond where this chart was. And like I said, we're 30 cents a watt or lower for solar panels in already, you know, this year. What that corresponds to, of course, is lower capital cost means lower electricity cost. And we've seen probably the most dramatic declines over the last number of years, over the last decade really, in the cost of solar electricity. Wind has declined as well, but not as dramatically. I think the nature of the equipment and innovation is slightly different for wind power. Historically, wind power was dramatically cheaper than solar to begin with, but now we're in record territory for both. You know, in the last 2 years, we've seen record power prices for renewable energy around the world. Power purchase agreements for solar under $20 a megawatt hour, which is 2 cents a kilowatt hour in Texas and California. And these are long-term power purchase agreements. So, excuse me, utilities procuring electricity for 20 years at rates well below where we see wholesale at today. Qatar had announced an 800 megawatt solar project at 1.5 cents a kilowatt hour on a long-term contract. And here in Canada, we've seen wind contracts awarded last year in Alberta for 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And we even have, you know, 100 megawatt wind farm here in Ontario, just south of Ottawa, that happens to be stalled halfway through construction because of some crazy political reasons. But the offtake agreement for that project is 6 Canadian cents a kilowatt hour for 20 years. So we're into record
What's
territory.
LCOE mean? What does LCOE mean?
Yeah, fair question. That's your levelized cost of electricity. So essentially, you levelize for, you know, everything that's unique about a particular that model, essentially the cost of your project over its lifetime. So if you're comparing, you know, in this case, we'd be comparing new build solar or new build wind versus new build coal in that case, and coming back to a number that represents the value over the lifetime. And we've seen, in addition to that, solar being paired with storage, also setting record prices in the US most recently, but I would say around the globe as well. We've, projects in Australia for Tim who's listening. Same thing, we're seeing record prices everywhere. But there's still a fundamental challenge. We have to move electricity around. Solar and wind, you know, they're inherently intermittent. The resource is free, it's readily available, but it's intermittent. And utility grid design is still, you know, 100 plus years old, and it's fundamentally based on large, centralized, centrally managed generation, public ownership. The driving principles being, and rightly so, being safety, reliability, affordability. These are all extremely important. But what we have is a fundamental challenge where we have this older grid design and we have compellingly cost-effective electricity generation sources. And the challenge is, how do we match that? How do we handle supply and demand? How do we ensure we have reliability and safety? You know, so we have reserve capacity so we can handle the demands of the grid when we are dealing with intermittent resources. A good example of that is this load chart, net load chart of a typical spring day in California. And this shows an average representation of that load chart year on year for the last decade or so. And what's interesting to note here is that from 2007 to 2017, there was substantial increase in the installed capacity of solar electricity generation in California. And what that does is, what we don't see on here is the inverse of that load curve is the daily solar production curve. So you have, when, you know, the sun comes up 6 in the morning, solar starts to produce. Demand during the day tends to drop anyway. And when you have significant solar production and you have load demand dropping to some degree, you come very close to the point where grid stability becomes threatened because your net load is so low. And then what you need as a utility is the ability, when that solar starts to ramp off toward the end of the day, but everybody starts coming home and the evening load starts to kick in, you have to ramp extremely quickly. And traditionally that's been handled by natural gas peaker plants, something that can ramp relatively quickly, but that's expensive capacity to have standing by if you don't need it. So this is a challenge. They call it the duck curve because it's shaped like a duck, but many other ISOs around the world, look at this and, understand that we have to be thoughtful about how we manage the integration of renewables in the grid when it comes to managing that matching supply and demand, particularly given the way the grid is currently designed. Now, the benefit of where storage steps in is that if storage can be added to this picture and allow one to shift that solar sunset essentially by a couple of hours or ramp very quickly, then that potentially offers a compelling solution. And as a result, California recently mandated that all new homes that are built in California, have solar installed. And many of those homeowners, of course, since they're having solar installed, are adding batteries as well. Really, the principle is fairly simple. It's shaving that peak off and shifting it by an amount necessary to allow that load curve to stay relatively stable. And batteries can ramp extremely quickly. And battery is an element of energy storage. It tends to be the most prolific at this point, but there are various types of energy storage that have different use cases and are better suited depending on what problem one's trying to solve. Batteries occupies probably the largest proportion of that potential use case, but you're trying to balance fast response behavior for managing power quality and long duration, large capacity, perhaps for backup, shifting those peaks multiple hours, this kind of thing. And lithium ion has tended to become the dominant battery technology that we're seeing being deployed globally at a utility scale. And that's largely because of the demand driven by the electric vehicle industry that's also driving down the cost of batteries. So we looked at the declining cost curve of solar panels, of solar and wind in terms of electricity prices. Similarly, we have a corresponding decline in the cost of batteries. And of the lithium ion battery technologies, we tend to see NMC, which is nickel, manganese, cobalt oxide, and LFP, which is lithium iron phosphate. Those two chemistries seem to be the dominant types that we're deploying in the market on a utility scale. And we're seeing pricing today in the range of $170 to $180 US per kilowatt hour. So this curve, if we look at where the curve is for 2020, we're not all far off that forecast as well. And really, when we look at the forward technology curves and pricing curves from the battery vendors that we typically talk to, 12 months from now, we're probably in the $130 a kilowatt hour price point. And again, a lot of that price decline is naturally driven by increase in demand. Electric vehicles are a significant driver of that demand, but utility scale, and I would say even behind the meter eventually, deployment of energy storage is becoming a significant market in and of itself. So battery storage system that we typically see deployed at the utility scale either takes the form of individual modules racked, installed inside of a container with fire suppression, HVAC, and all the safety features built into a container. We're also building these projects in purpose-built building facilities where you have more centralized fire suppression, more centralized HVAC systems, and each has its benefits. We tend to see that the larger a project gets, potentially swings it toward buildings, but a big part of battery storage implementation and design is certainly fire code and the requirements for thermal management, fire suppression, ventilation, deflagration. So there are UL certifications that have come out recently that really drive the way that needs to be designed. And battery cell manufacturers have to run and pass stringent tests that measure the potential cell-to-cell thermal propagation within a module in order to be safe. And a lot of that's driven by, unfortunately, what's been some catastrophic events around the world in the last year. Some significant battery fires in South Korea and in Arizona in the US, some battery explosions and fires. And again, when the forensics were done on those projects, it came down to design standards for the safety weren't what they should have been. So, you know, a lot of times we hear, at least when we're involved in the industry, you know, people express concern about the safety of deploying batteries at large scale, and that's certainly a consideration, but it's it can certainly be dealt with. So as I mentioned before, some of the services that a battery can offer to the grid go beyond just shaping a solar product or helping to manage load and supply. Some of the fast response capabilities of batteries allow you to offer ancillary services like reactive power compensation, frequency control and regulation, voltage control, all the way to the longer duration things like backup and black start for, you know, for conventional generation that would otherwise need significant diesel generation to restart after a shutdown. Another important contribution of energy storage, particularly battery storage deployed at the grid scale, is the ability for utilities to defer capacity investment and to ease transmission congestion. An example of that, you know, really is, you know, similar in thinking to perhaps how, you know, highways are designed to handle peak traffic. And, you know, much like we would do with circuit design and using capacitors, you know, capacitors handle the peak, so you don't have to, you know, if you didn't have those, you'd have to oversize everything else. And what we don't want to do, what we want to avoid at the grid infrastructure level is having to make capacity investments like one might have to do when it comes to designing highways, where a lot of that resource sits idle and unused and is really oversized just to handle the peak. So what storage allows us to do is to right size that infrastructure, take care of those peaks, and thus defer what might be significant investment in transmission infrastructure for a longer period of time. We've deployed a number of projects like that where that's precisely what they're for. You know, if you have we recently completed a project in New York City where it was extremely dense urban environment, very costly and difficult to bring new generation in. And we placed utility scale batteries there to take care of the, you know, the peaks in demand throughout the year and allowed them to defer that generation upgrade by more than a decade. So how does energy storage being linked to renewables address the fundamental problem that we're talking about? I think the value of standalone storage is, of course, significant. You know, we mentioned the ancillary services it can offer, and there's definitely value in that. I think where we truly unlock it is when we create a capacity product out of an intermittent generation resource. So adding storage to renewables allows us to shift renewable energy from the category of boutique and experimental, like I mentioned before, and more into the mainstream where it can start to compete with conventional generation. Because that, and we've seen a good example of that recently. We're looking at a project right now in Southern California that's precisely designed to do that kind of thing. It's a 600 megawatt hour battery storage facility paired with a 700 megawatt solar generation facility. And the battery duration is sized for 4 hours. So it's going to take what you normally see as the solar generation curve and capture during the day a significant amount of the oversupply of solar, which is extremely low cost power at that stage, and shift it more to match the periods where demand is significant. And in this case, this is DC coupled storage. So it's storage that is deployed behind your inverters in your solar field, again, to capture that energy that might otherwise even be lost. So it's harvesting energy that would otherwise have been clipped off by the inverters. So what are some of the challenges, if we were to try to adopt it immediately and in a widespread fashion? I think some of the challenges that we face still is the basic electric utility business model, where their traditional revenue stream is based on selling kilowatt hours. So the notion of conservation, the notion of consumers producing their own electricity, of shifting away from a centrally managed generation model, it's counter to their business model. It's counter to how they generate revenue. But I think for those utilities that are willing to embrace it, it represents significant opportunity, because like we just talked about, the ability to defer some of those capital investments, the ability to defer investments in transmission infrastructure to handle future peaks, that is very expensive capital investment. Some of the smaller utilities don't own their own generation, so they're buying that electricity from another utility. If they can work with renewable energy generation and storage, either in front of the meter or behind the meter, what we typically refer to as distributed energy resources, they can hedge against some of that input cost that they don't otherwise control. Utilities are looking at time rates to try and shift demand into areas of the day where, of course, they can predict, they can manage their supply to meet that demand in a more cost-effective fashion. And what we're truly seeing is, in some respects, the democratization of energy generation. We talk about the prosumer, and that's not just a term used in the renewable energy space. That's, it's essentially and we see a lot of that nowadays, where the consumer becomes the producer as well. And so we're seeing significant increase in behind the meter solar deployment. The drop in the capital cost of batteries, of course, is allowing homeowners to become producers and to, again, shape that product to match their load. That takes strain off utilities. So I think there's a real opportunity for the utility business model to evolve. And I think the utilities that don't move fast enough, they're still going to have that change foisted on them in some respect, which may come at even more cost down the road. Now, utilities don't traditionally move very fast. Safety and reliability are still paramount, and these things can't be ignored. but we are seeing examples of utilities around the world who are embracing that innovation and are stepping into a new business model where it is proving to be more lucrative. So how far can we go in the near term? Is 100% renewable energy, we hear about it mentioned once in a while. Is it a pipe dream? Is it possibly practical? That really shines light on some of the fundamental constraints and challenges that we have currently built into our system, built into our way of managing electricity, of how we move electrons around, of how we settle price. You know, to truly go all the way would require us to really embrace deep electrification. You know, that means the transportation sector, manufacturing as well. I think the COVID-19 situation, which is, of course, something we're all dealing with, I think highlights for us how perhaps some of these things aren't completely impossible. Perhaps some of this truly, you know, fundamental paradigm shift opportunities may be more possible than we think. But it means thinking differently about how we manage the grid. It means Energy 4.0, which, you know, is a term coined by the utility space, the energy industry. You know, we hear of Industry 4.0. Energy 4.0 is about leveraging the Internet of Things, sensors, data and analytics with smart grids and microgrids. And as you envision a situation where more and more people generate electricity at a much more local level, you have an increased need for monitoring, for understanding electricity flow. It's a massive amount of data, you know, and there are definitely companies getting into that space that are really revolutionizing how electricity is delivered, how much choice is offered to consumers, you know, where we're not far away from a situation where in some jurisdictions, a consumer can choose where, you know, which, you know, they can choose where the electricity they want to use is being generated. Of course, cybersecurity becomes a whole other element for discussion, and it's very much a relevant topic in the industry, even for conventional generation, you know, plants that are monitored 24/7. That's already an issue and will be increasingly so as we move into that new world of Energy 4.0. But it is happening. You know, we're this notion of 100% renewables. We're seeing jurisdictions around the world, states in the US, California, Mexico, DC, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, you know, have all implemented near-term mandates for 100% of their electricity coming from renewable energy. Of course, not everybody is willing to embrace the change. And politics is an unavoidable force in this industry. In many cases, it's hindered our progress. Similarly, it's been the necessary catalyst and tool to drive a lot of growth in the business. So we see around the world over the years, feed-in tariff programs, which are essentially above, you know, agreements that pay producers of renewable energy an above market price for their electricity, with the intention being to grow the industry and drive pricing down. We usually see those kind of heavy policy tools last for a certain amount of time and then disappear and the market takes over. We saw that here in Ontario. It wasn't a resounding success, I think, because anytime something is so heavily politically driven, it's very vulnerable to being changed 180 degrees depending on political winds. The other question I think that underlies a lot of the discussion for some people is, well, what about jobs? What about job creation? You know, Trump's promise to resurrect the coal industry in the US, you know, was very much about jobs. But I think the writing's been on the wall for quite some time for coal. We've seen steady declines in the job numbers for coal for many decades. And I think it proved to be a losing proposition at the end of the day in the last couple of years, where the resurgence in coal jobs just wasn't there. At the end of the day, there's a train moving. It's not likely to be stopped. And this is one of them. Nearly, you know, one statistic is that last year in the US, 3.3 million Americans were working in the clean energy industry. That outnumbered fossil fuel workers altogether by a factor of 3 to 1. And an interesting case study is, you know, if we look at West Virginia, which would be kind of the heart of coal mining and coal production in the US, you know, for them, that jobs argument couldn't be more acute. 17% of their GDP last year was contributed by coal mining. And, you know, statewide, I think 22,000 jobs or something like that, sourcing the vast majority of the coal for the US. And then next door, you have the state of Virginia that announced a target of 100% renewable, clean electricity by 2050. The way they see that manifesting is an aggressive target to add 3 gigawatts of storage and 5 gigawatts of offshore wind. There are two utilities, Dominion Energy and Appalachian. Dominion needs to be 100% renewable energy by 2045 and Appalachian by 2050. And closer to home, we have Ontario Power Generation here in Ontario that recently shut down Ontario has closed all of its coal generation incidentally, but a hallmark project that reached operation last year was the shutting of their 4,000 megawatt coal plant in Nanticoke. And on that same property, they built a 44 megawatt solar farm. So really the trend here is that coal is heading out and it's leaving a major capacity gap, but it's a key part of our ability to try and reverse that trend, to move the biggest levers while we're on the short runway. When we look at the global trend on coal production was about 14% lower in 2019 than the year before, and it comprised 22% of the total electricity supply mix. And that's the largest ever reduction in coal recorded. And that gives us hope. You know, we're definitely seeing movement there. But it's helped by, you know, the fundamental fact that the cost to generate renewables is dropping dramatically. So what's standing in the way of it? Why, if coal's declining and solar's cheap and wind is cheap and batteries are getting cheaper, what's stopping us from going all the way and reversing that greenhouse gas emissions trend to the level we need to in 10 years? That reminds me of, you know, a decade ago, before I was working with RES, you know, I was in an Ontario town, and I was making a presentation to a local council for a big infrastructure project, a big power plant. And there was a gallery full of very angry locals who were heckling the whole time, substantial opposition to the project, which some can imagine. And when I left that meeting, I was followed down the highway, threatened over the phone. You know, you would think that what I was proposing, you know, the people in the gallery at that council meeting were probably the residents of this house you see in the picture. What I was actually proposing was this. And it's interesting, what it reveals is that in many cases, this has very little to do with the technology or health or economics. In many respects, it's just the human's fundamental resistance to change, you know, never minding the highly industrialized machine in the foreground, which nobody has an issue with. So, you know, in many respects, it's that fundamental resistance to change that possibly stops us from imagining what solutions we could implement if we only tried. You know, so where was Greta when I needed her? Would have been really helpful. But I think what that represents is that there is a substantial movement. I think in the last number of years, we've seen, you know, agree with what she says or not, the reality is that there's a much broader conversation. I think it represents a critical shift in the amount of attention being paid to this issue by not just, you know, one segment of the population. It's broadly being accepted, you know, also in the corporate sector, in the private sector, and businesses are taking it extremely seriously. You know, we work with BlackRock. BlackRock is the world's largest asset manager. And when Larry Fink came out, I think it was a few weeks ago, you know, and made some strong statements, one of them being that climate risk, investment risk, and companies that are not investing based on sustainability and not taking into account climate risk were in serious trouble of existence. And so, you know, we see that across not just BlackRock, we see that across many of the pension funds and banks who are looking to divest of fossil fuels from their portfolios, of coal generation and other things, looking to really align their portfolios with the broader environmental, social, and governance criteria. And, you know, that is lending significant weight to the discussion, and it's creating an economic context for us to significantly advance renewable energy and storage. And again, use that to bend the curve. You know, we see that in our own business fairly regularly. We are, you know, we see an increasing number of contracts for electricity generation from our renewable facilities directly with corporate off-takers like Microsoft, Google, General Mills, and others. And it's becoming everyday business for them, increasing the amount of renewable energy that's driving their data centers and their operations and so on. You know, it's now a daily occurrence. We see headlines everywhere about how renewable energy is overtaking the fossil fuel industry. You know, I would say despite some of that resistance to change and despite some of the deep-seated paradigms when it comes to how electricity ought to be delivered and paid for. But I think, you know, the message has to be careful, and perhaps a warning to those who don't embrace that change. You know, we don't want to be the Kodak who, you know, what you're looking at there, if you haven't seen it before, is the first digital camera. And that was invented by an engineer at Kodak in their lab. And they just couldn't see past the fact that they were in the chemical business and didn't think there was a future in digital photography. So, you know, it may this notion of deep electrification or 100% renewables may seem lofty, but I often wonder how it is that we've become as comfortable as we are with the status quo. And I always try and picture what it would be like to introduce today the notion of the gasoline powered vehicle, you know, to stand in a public meeting and suggest that no one having seen it before, we're going to invent a vehicle that's can hurtle down the highway on some rubber tires, and will, for the sake of convenience, we'll send the cars going this way and the ones going the opposite way, we'll just have them separated by a yellow line. And while we're at it, let's strap a tank full of highly flammable fluid to the bottom of the vehicle. And hey, when that runs out and they need to fill it up, we'll just have, you know, anyone can pull over and grab a hose and squirt this toxic fluid into your vehicle. So if we were to introduce that concept today, I'm sure it would never fly. So we have two levers, I think. You know, we can play with supply, we can play with demand when it comes to satisfying that fundamental need for energy that it's largely driving the current impact on global greenhouse gas emissions. Deep electrification is not easy, but generating electricity from renewables and pairing it with storage is the low-hanging fruit. It gives us fuel flexibility. It gives us cost certainty on the input. You know, if you compare a solar power facility with batteries to create somewhat of a capacity product, what we know is the cost of the solar resource is never going to go up. And we also know from recent history that the price of capital equipment is only likely to go down. But if you're investing in a new natural gas facility or a coal plant or some other form of conventional generation that relies on a more volatile cost of input, fuel input, it's a much more troubling story. So there's momentum, you know, there's policy we probably need to implement. You know, Tom Rand, who is a Toronto-based clean tech venture capitalist, he talks about building on-ramps to a technology highway, you know, where he says the Chinese drove down the cost of solar panels and batteries over the years. And those technologies, they're not necessarily revolutionary anymore. They're well known, you know, but they dominate the traffic on the highway. And unless somebody actively creates an opportunity for something new to get into the mainstream, and he's pointing to policy as the tool for that, then it's very difficult for that to happen. So we can't get away from the need for some policy, but I think what we saw earlier with the headlines, what we see every single day, is that policy appetite is increasingly there. The economic argument makes that discussion a whole lot easier. And so I think, you know, I think there's hope based on that. I think we do have an opportunity to borrow a super relevant phrase, you know, to flatten the climate curve by taking what might seem like some dramatic measures now. So in an unprecedented time with a global pandemic, I think in many respects, the pandemic gives me hope. Well, thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Bart. Hugh Reek has had his hand up for a very long time. I'm not sure whether he's still there with us. Are you there, Hugh? In which case, I'm going to unmute everybody else.
How do we ask the question to Colin Rose?
Go ahead, Colin.
Oh, thank you. Bart, I thought you put up a sterling defense of what I consider to be a dead-end nuclear has its hands down over all this renewable stuff because it's firm, it's safe, because I believe that all three of the major accidents were completely due to human stupidity. It's extremely small relative to the space taken by all the paraphernalia of windmills and solar farms and things. And it's well proven. I would like to particularly advocate the thorium-based nuclear energy system, which for some reason or other, well, I know the reasons. The reasons is being largely ignored in the West, and the reason was because the defense industry wanted to use plutonium out of uranium, and the thorium-based system doesn't produce plutonium. It's safe, it doesn't run away. There are many, many aspects. France uses 80% of France's electrical energy is nuclear, 50% of Ontario's is nuclear. So I'm not going to go on and on and on with this, but in my opinion, this is not the way to go. I think that nuclear energy can be made completely safe, can be made incredibly economic, and it is firm, and that's one of the big problems with all of the paraphernalia that you're talking about. So what would you say to that?
So I think I got most of that. At the end of the day, I think you were making a strong argument for nuclear, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and I apologize if I didn't catch it all, but I think the point I would make there is that, you know, we need to have some mix of technology. I don't think we can switch everything over to renewable energy tomorrow. It takes a transition. There's still base load that needs to be managed. There's still a role for, look at hydro, you know, something that's extremely dispatchable, you know, can manage significant amount of generation, you know, but the ability to grow hydro is limited. In the same way, I think if we see that the future is going towards a more decentralized topology, then I think investing heavily in nuclear is only entrenches us further into this older centralized model that
I'm sorry if I can interrupt. There are many, there's a lot of work going on, and there are many designs for what you might call mini nuclear, the block size systems. So that is available if we want to use it.
so then the question I think becomes, if you had no alternative, that looks, you know, that's an interesting discussion to have. But in a world where, and here's where I think the fundamental economics of where we're seeing solar and wind and battery storage going raises the natural question, if I have access to that technology, if I have absolute certainty about the cost of my inputs for running that kind of generation, it's infinitely distributable, it's very easy to scale. Why would I look for an alternative if I can pair that with some of conventional, you know, as I wean myself off of other conventional generation? That's where my head is at.
The very simple answer to that is because it's firm energy, 24/7. And that is invaluable.
And I think, and I appreciate that, and I think that the reason that we can't shift super quickly is because everything's built around reserve capacity, make sure you have oversupply so that you can handle the variability in demand. I think where we're going is to a world where, you know, load is dynamic. Load is extremely dynamic. People shut things on and off, you know, it's dynamic on that side of the equation. we need to get to a situation where we just have a much smarter, you know, this is where the energy 4.0 and this kind of thing comes in, where we have a much better match between dynamic load and the ability of supply to match. You know, what's very difficult to do with nuclear, for instance, is ramp it, right? So it's used for that base load. Now, if you look at that California load curve that we looked at, once you get down to, you know, a low enough net load, you have to start shutting off some of that base load. Yes, it's firm and there's a benefit to that, but once you're in a situation where you have to shut it off, it's very difficult. It takes a long time to shut it off and takes a long time to bring it back up. So those are some of the inherent challenges with those technologies, I think, that we're going to jump past, you know, a little bit like developing countries that went straight to mobile phones and skipped landlines. I think that if you had a blank slate, you had no electric infrastructure at all today, what would you start with? I'm not sure you'd start with centralized generation.
Okay, I think we've got another question. I'm going to have to mute everybody if we can't find out who it is that's snoring away. Bart, there are some questions in the chat line. There was one about lithium chemistry being possibly going to be a move away from it. Can you see the chat line?
Yeah, let me open it up here.
Right.
On the right screen. There we go.
Okay, I'm going to.
I saw the little.
Yeah, I'm going to mute everybody, and then anybody that wants to speak can unmute their microphone. Please. Okay. Bart, you can. Oh, I've accidentally muted you, Bart. There you go.
You got me? Okay. I think that's a great question. I think that's partly why, you know, I didn't want to gloss over some of the challenges we've seen. You know, some of the things that still need sorting when it comes to large scale battery energy storage are, you know, the lithium ion technology. You know, batteries aren't just plagued by the fact that, you know, they can potentially have catastrophic fires, although that's something to pay attention to. You know, they use scarce resources. You know, there are a number of companies that we've talked to now who, and some Canadian companies who are leading in this, incidentally, who are working on very efficient recycling of these batteries at end of life and repurposing. They actually harvest all the materials and produce new batteries with them. Some of that's promising, but those are issues that do plague that technology. And so I think right now we see lithium chemistry is ubiquitous, and it's, you know, it's largely being driven by the development in the electric vehicle business. But I can well see where we start to have, and we're already having discussions like this in the industry, where there's a resurgence of looking at, you know, thermal storage at a small scale and a large scale, incidentally, and other types of technology. And there are utility scale storage technologies that are viable and being implemented and developed that aren't based on batteries. I think at the moment, though, in the short term, you know, the lithium ion chemistry shows an awful lot of promise for wide deployment. And like I said, if with some of the new UL certifications and fire protection requirements governing the design of these projects, they can be done in a very safe fashion. And, you know, like I said, what we've seen where that's gone catastrophically wrong is when it's been designed wrong. You know, no ventilation or no accounting for the thermal management that's obviously required when you're building a system like this.
And there is another one further down about from Tim Chapman. about
How we address overconsumption, I think.
appliances that turn themselves off.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, you know, this is where some of the more forward thinking utilities are, you know, trying to toggle the right levers to implement demand side management, basically, where, you know, we have that in Ontario, which is begging for market reform, but the way it currently sits, you know, they have some complicated time of use calculations for large corporate energy users that if they can just shift their demand a little bit, so if they have some control over their demand, using storage is mostly how it's done, and they can avoid the 5 coincident peaks in Ontario, which are the 5 most significant load peaks. They can save millions, depending on the size of facility. But at the end of the day, that's just sort of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It doesn't eliminate cost out of the system. It just lets them avoid paying that cost. So I think where we're seeing, you know, we are seeing some of the smarter utilities go is making good use of time of day pricing, trying to shift demand to when they can generate electricity cheaper. You know, I think there's been great strides in energy efficiency. I think it's rare to find a light bulb that's not LED. You know, that kind of thing is certainly driving down energy use. And I think the forecasts for energy demand are generally more bearish than bullish. And, you know, when a lot of these utilities are doing their resource planning years out, I think, you know, in some cases they're seeing fairly level to minimal demand growth. So I think conservation is absolutely an important thing. That's probably the lowest hanging fruit. But again, it still takes a shift in the way utilities think, because it pulls the rug out from the revenue model unless they can get ahead of it and you know, and shift the way that they deliver, you know, extract value from the business they're in.
Okay, a couple of other people have typed in requests, but do we have any verbal questions before we take those? You'll have to unmute your microphone, bottom left-hand corner in the screen. John Bynes?
John Williams.
Can you hear?
Yep, I hear you.
I have a question. With respect to Ontario Hydro, how much of their planning is now done in terms of distributed generating, or are they still stuck in their old one power station, one area sort of concept?
Yeah, and that's where I say Ontario is begging for market reform, because at the moment there's not a lot of signals, not enough signals in the market to really drive, you know, incent the right kind of behavior to grow on the distributed side of the business. So our net metering regulations are severely wanting, you know, but it's on the horizon. There, you know, the Ontario Energy Board and the IESO are, you know, have run consultations over the last year specifically aimed at market reform, and particularly to try and drive at how do they handle more distributed energy resources, how do they implement storage. You know, we've done some pilot projects for the IESO in Ontario, but again, it's just pilot projects, where the rest, you know, there are other jurisdictions in the world that have gone long past pilot. So yeah, I would say that that mentality is still fairly deeply entrenched. And right now, you know, there's, for the last number of years, and it's ongoing, there's been this discussion in the context of some short-term declining energy demand, a a known capacity shortfall that we're going to be facing in a number of years when the decision has to be made on refurbishing or retiring certain nuclear assets. You know, that discussion's been happening, but there's still a lot of inertia there to get around that deep-seated notion of it's just got to be centrally managed, and we'll build more wires. And yeah, that's
Okay, thank you.
John Williams was on a moment ago. Are you still there, John?
Yes, I am indeed. Thank you. This is an excellent presentation, and I recommend it to be distributed. I work around the world with lots of utilities. But as engineers, I think we have to be a bit careful that we don't put the wrong signals out. I'll give you two examples. When we look at the cost of energy per kilowatt hour and compare thermal, which gives us capacity and energy, to solar, which only gives you energy, we are misleading politicians, and they jump on this information and come to the wrong conclusions. The second one is your graph of declining miners. I think it's much more useful to show a graph showing the extraction of coal, which goes totally the other way because of coal consumption in India and in China. So could you address that? How do engineers deal with politicians and keep them on the straight and narrow?
Yeah. That's great, because even you're absolutely right. It can be very quickly a misleading discussion, and then people automatically categorize, put things in mental buckets, and you never get anywhere. So, we have to be honest, and that's why I bring up the fact that renewable energy alone doesn't solve the problem because of the inherent intermittency. Unless we could adjust the supply side completely, which we're not going to. What we're seeing truly compete with natural gas and coal-fired generation is solar as a capacity product. And you make solar a capacity product, or close, not 100% capacity product, but then again, a coal-fired generation station isn't 100% capacity product either.
Do you have an approximate price for them?
So that in Nevada recently awarded 6 solar plus storage power purchase agreements, long-term, and those are, the storage is sized to be about 25% of the capacity of the solar facilities in most cases. That seems to be fairly typical.
Sure.
And those power contracts were, the lowest was 2.3 cents a kilowatt hour for 25 years. And when you do the analysis on, and some of those are made up of that amount of money, that payment for some of those projects is a portion capacity payment, portion energy payment. And when you model that against a natural gas plant in that same jurisdiction, now you're talking about significant solar resource and adding batteries to make that, a 25 or 30% capacity product. Then on that level basis, it competes aggressively with the cost of new natural gas.
Thank you. Would you have any papers on that by any chance?
Yeah, I certainly can send you a Bloomberg report that did a deep analysis on those 6 offtake agreements.
Thank you.
I'd be happy to.
If anybody wants feedback like that, I've just put my email address into the chat column. And as far as I know, that's about the only way we can get in touch with each other. So I'm happy to pass that on to Bart. Also, if you wanted a copy of the recording from this, I'll again try and send you a link for that when we've got it. We did have a question about compressed air, but it looks as if somebody else answered it for you, Bart. So you're off the hook on that one. Have I missed any other questions in the chat column? There was a question from Graham Allen about large commercial users valuing resilience of supply.
Yeah, and I think
If Graham is still on, maybe he could ask it.
Yeah, I'm here. I was keeping quiet because I know where Bart lives, so I could always go and ask it tomorrow. So
No, for the sake of us all, Graham, why don't you ask us?
So really, it's, I mean, my understanding is it's kind of hard to make a really solid business case for a commercial user. And I'm talking about a Class A large scale commercial user. But then I've heard people talk about building different aspects of the business case, and resilience of supply is one of those potential add-ons. So how much is that really valued, and how is that just a kind of a tip over the edge, or is it a really sustainable part of an offering?
I suspect that it has a lot to do with the nature of the business you're in as a commercial entity and the region of the world that you're in. You know, how much is resilient is you know, what's the risk of poor supply, unreliable supply. So I think in, you know, very mature markets, that's probably not something that keeps these people up at night. And it's more about, you know, like I alluded to, you know, there's a bit of a temporary surge of companies that, and you may be aware of them, that, you know, are touting their expertise when it comes to software modeling, so they can model. It comes down to, you know, we have this notion of we have this concept of global adjustment in the Ontario market, and those of you in Ontario, you pay a chunk of that on your bill every month, and that, you know, goes to pay. That's all the fixed cost and the debt and everything else rolled into a bucket, and that bucket gets socialized across ratepayers. And those big corporate Class A customers, if they can partner with somebody who's sophisticated enough to predict ahead of time when those 5 coincident peaks are going to occur during the coming year, and if that company is capable of being able to respond at a moment's notice and shift their demand off of those peaks, they have to know that the peak is happening. It's almost it's, you know, if they can avoid that peak, that's the kind of money that sits them up in their chair straight and makes them make a business decision on installing a storage facility on their facility. But I would say it's that kind of thing that drives it more than resiliency of supply, because I think, you know, they're in an environment where supply is quite reliable to begin with. Hopefully that answered your question, but let me know if it didn't.
I have a question.
Yeah.
May I?
Go ahead.
So there's this notion in Nigeria that solar power is unreliable. In the sense that many engineers in meetings tend to say, oh, well, we're not sure about what battery you're going to use, or we don't know exactly what capacity to put there. We don't even know like what the lifespan would be. And I personally believe they have some type of interest in saying that people should go with a transmission line, to do like a 33 kilovolt transmission line connected to the national grid to power something of less load, such as a communication tower. And my question is simply, how does one go about explaining the risk of using a solar panel for something like a remote communication tower? And what are the downsides of using something as ridiculous as a 33 kV line to power that up? And on top of that, use a backup generator, because power supply in Africa is not reliable, to just power a communication tower, which is kind of silly in my opinion. So how would one go about convincing people? With
in 20 seconds, so I'm not.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's you're probably dealing with, like you say, there may be ulterior motives there if they don't see that for the logical, you know, if they don't see the value in that right off the bat, then it may be that there's something else motivating it. I think there's still that entrenched notion again of, you know, solar panels are boutique. You know, you pay a ton of money, and it's sort of cute, and you know, maybe it keeps an LED light running, but really, can we live off it? And I think that, you know, maybe that was a legitimate perspective some years ago. I think what I'm trying to highlight here is the fact that the technology has changed dramatically. A decade ago, we weren't talking like this. We weren't, you know, this was honestly where we're at today was a pipe dream 10 years ago. And so I think it would come down to simply demonstrating in a case like that. I suppose the only way to convince somebody is to simply show them the economic equation and model the reliability of that line, the capital cost of that line, the maintenance every year of that line, because lines aren't maintenance free, versus, you know, solar and some batteries. And these days, solar panels are, you know, come with substantial warranties. Batteries, depending, you know, the lifetime of a battery is highly dependent on its use case. And this is why even at, you know, utility scale battery deployment is very customized and highly dependent on how somebody intends to use the battery. But nevertheless, you know, if the use case is understood and the battery is backed by warranties and the solar panels are backed by warranties, and yeah, I guess it's an easier argument in areas where the deployment of solar and batteries is more ubiquitous, so it's become almost mainstream and commonplace. But I think that mindset is something that, you know, still exists everywhere. Not just in Nigeria, that's for sure. So I probably didn't give you a nice, tidy little argument, but.
No, thank you. Your argument is quite solid. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? I think the silence means that you've answered all of our questions. Thank you, Bart.
Transitioning from someone who digs up and burns coal to getting involved with the environment, sort of renewable side of things.
Sorry, what was that, Tim?
I missed, yeah, that was Tim. I might have missed the first part of your comment.
I've spent quite a bit of my career helping people dig up coal material handling, and always had a bit of an inkling to transition into renewables. Any advice?
Well, our teams in Australia are going crazy. The market is seemingly hot there. We've built a bunch of wind and solar and energy storage. I know people to connect you to if that's what if you want to look at that more closely domestically.
That'd be fantastic.
I think I had a slide here that shows for what it's worth. That's where we operate there. So we're quite a large global company, but all we do is renewables. But you can see Australia is nice and highlighted there.
Drop us your email, Tim, and we'll put you in touch. And if there are no other questions, I think, Bart, we owe you a big vote of thanks. There is a way of clapping hands if anybody wants to try it. That's, you can do that. So thank you very much. It's been a very entertaining evening. And as I said, we'll try and follow it up as best we can. And thank you for all your questions. It's been an interesting exercise in technology, as well as a bit of mind stretching for the subject matter. So thank you very much, Bart. It's been much appreciated.
Yeah, thanks for joining, everybody. I know you've got you're all different time zones, so I appreciate the attention and good questions. Thank you.
I'll leave the lines open for about another couple of 3 minutes to see if anybody wants to chat with each other. If it's,
I just like Colin that I was speaking. I just like to say to everybody, this was my first experience with this. It's difficult to log in, but once I got logged in, I think this thing is really very successful. And well done, everybody. Particularly you. Thank you for putting it on.
well, thank you for that vote of thanks, Colin. We'll get you a better microphone for the next time you dial in.
Yes, I'll wear a headset next time. I'm sorry, I'm just using the.
That's all right. We did very well. Yeah, thank you. If anybody's got technical suggestions, put them on a postcard, please.
Don't they say write them on the back of a $20 bill?
Yeah, they're all useless right now.
Fumigated.
Yeah. Yeah, you can't use them. And we've maintained our audience as well, Bart. So we peaked at about 32. We're only down to 25 now. So that's always a good sign, I think.
Yeah, well, the internet infrastructure around the world seems to be holding up.
Yeah, yeah. But we're slowly losing them now. So when we get down to 20, I think I'll call that a night.
I'm signing off. Good night, all.
Okay. Good night, Colin.
Thank you.
Thanks,
John.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Bart, and thanks to Frank for organising as well and coordinating. Sterling job. You've got the job.
Who, Bart or me?
The organizer.
Yeah.
I think Bart's here as a one-off, Frank. You're now our IT coordinator.
No bother.
Frank, could we go off share screen so we can see everybody?
Oh yeah, if I stop sharing.
That's better.
Oh yes, yeah, yeah.
I was just leaving the company advertisement.
Yeah. I think that worked fairly well. The one bit I haven't completely. Oh, let me turn off the recording. That's before we get.